Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Jeffrey Driscoll, and I'm with Communications in the City of Edmonton. Thank you for joining us today to talk about the budget discussions. With us today is Mayor Don Iveson, as well as Interim City Manager Adam Laughlin. We'll have them speak, and then we'll go to questions. But before we do, I just want to take this opportunity to thank our interpreters, Kevin Culp, and I've got this, Alicia Ponciano. And thank you very much for being here. Over to you, Mr. Mayor.
And thank you for joining us today. Council and administration have completed our deliberations for Budget 2021. This was a difficult budget. As is the case with many Edmontonians and businesses in our city, this year has been hard financially for all of us. And that being said, we understand that during these trying times, Edmontonians do look to their city for support and for the important and essential municipal services that we provide them. Which is why I'm pleased to say that today City Council passed a budget that strikes the right balance between finding efficiencies during these trying economic times, while also ensuring that we're supporting economic recovery and protecting key city services and infrastructure. In the end, Council administration worked together to achieve a 0% tax levy and effect a property tax freeze for the first time in over 2 decades. Now, by approving $57.4 million in budget reductions, Council has ensured that we're responsive to the budget constraints this year has presented us with, while also ensuring we're keeping core municipal services Edmontonians need to weather this pandemic. But these cuts are not done without some pain, however. Like many Edmonton businesses and organizations, we're forced to make the difficult decisions to lay off staff, something that I know will be hard for our organization's morale. These hardworking colleagues, and we're losing people with a lot of institutional memory and expertise in this staffing reduction, will be sorely missed. And I just want to say to those who do leave us that I am so thankful for your service to our city. And while difficult, this decision does allow us to keep the tax levy at 0% in this exceptional year. And I will stress that this kind of reduction in staffing levels is really not possible every year. The majority of these positions, though, that were lost are being covered through vacancies and through attrition, which is also not possible on an ongoing basis. So this really is a special circumstance in a very difficult year. These staffing reductions will certainly make things that the city does more challenging, but against all the other pressures we're facing in this economic and pandemic circumstance, it is the responsible thing to do. We'll also continue to look at efficiencies across our organization and within our workforce. And in fact, this is one of the things that we've asked our new city manager to review when he starts in January, especially as it relates to management positions and span of control and ratios between management staff and frontline staff. Now, I should also add that I'm thankful that Edmonton Public Library offered up efficiencies of $1.1 million themselves along the lines of the $16 million that the city found through efficiencies and expenditure management, and that they were also able to bring forward $3.2 million in one-time reductions in costs related to reduced library activity due to COVID-19. So really no stone was left unturned across the broader civic family. But during this public hearing, we heard from Edmontonians who were concerned about certain municipal services and grants that were brought forward in the original budget cut proposals. I'm very glad that we were able to save some, not all of these services and grants that we heard Edmontonians defend so passionately during the budget public hearing, including the spay and neuter program. All the planned service hours for the transit bus network design will be there when the bus network redesign happens, and the Green Shack programming, for example. And I'm also very glad that we were able to keep funding to the Community Investment Grant Program for at least the one more year here by using, in fact, some of the money originally allocated to police that has been set aside for community investment. We will we will review and rework this community investment grant program, though, so that we can ensure that it better aligns with the goals and outcomes of the city plan and the social priorities identified in the community safety and well-being work that we're undertaking and in our goals around building a healthier city. So that program will get overhauled but the organizations who rely on it will still be able to come forward for funding in 2021. Beyond that, we'll build a better grant program going forward. Now, I supported this motion because I believe in the premise that investing in community is critical, especially right now, and that strengthening social supports and programs will allow us to better weather this pandemic and build a stronger and healthier community. Also, transit is an essential element in our plan that will allow us to get through this health crisis, and given the high proportion of workers in our city, including essential service workers who depend on our transit system to participate in the workforce, I am glad that we're able to return those service hours that had been proposed for a cut, and also that Council was able to freeze cash fares for adults at least until May of 2021 in light of some of these COVID circumstances, at which point Council will revisit the discussion around the strategy for transit pricing in light of the bus network design going in and smart fare as well. So continuing discussion about that. And ultimately how we can ensure that our transit system has the resources it needs to recover and grow. Though I would point out that we've really increased the number of concession fares that are available for youth, for example, and for folks with low income, we've expanded eligibility for the low income bus pass. So ultimately, those programs will continue and have been scaled up considerably so that the people with most acute need do have lower barrier access to public transit, especially in these circumstances. Finally, I do want to reflect for a moment on the fact that though it seems endless, this pandemic is temporary. And we will emerge from it, and when we do, it's essential that the city is in a good position to recover. And that's why we didn't make short-term decisions in this budget or pull from the cookie jar to cover ongoing grocery budgets. And it's why I pushed ultimately for a budget that, while mindful of the fiscal constraints we're under, allows us to keep investing in assets and services that will allow Edmonton to emerge post-COVID a healthier, urban, and climate-resilient city that supports and anchors a prosperous metro region. In other words, to advance the very same city plan objectives that we gave third reading to earlier this week. Finally, I'd like to make clear that our work on reducing costs and supporting economic recovery will not end after these budget discussions. Next year, we'll get into the bulk of the reimagine work that we've been talking about, which will include major reviews and continuing reviews of civic services. And this work will be critical to how the city adapts to the new normal and emerges, hopefully, stronger than before. So now I'll pass it to Adam for his comments on the budget, and then of course, be happy to take your questions.
Thanks, Mr. Mayor. Good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for joining us. On the update of the city budget adjustment, the Mayor noted this has been challenging as we grappled with the unprecedented effects of both the economic downturn our region is experiencing and the effects brought on by the global pandemic. Together, these factors created a significant impact on our budget and on our taxpayers. We needed to tackle this carefully while keeping sight of our long-term goals for a vibrant and connected Edmonton. When administration presented its budget recommendations in November, the approach was to reduce the tax levy in 2021 because economic indicators suggest that Edmonton businesses and households are struggling with the financial effects of the COVID-19 pandemic. Administration recommended a tax levy increase of 0%, and as you've heard from the Mayor, 0% is where Council landed. We thank the Mayor and the rest of Council for a thoughtful and thorough discussion on our recommendations. As the Mayor has outlined, Council has made some big decisions through this year's budget adjustment, and these come with some staffing impacts and service changes for Edmontonians. The 2021 budget includes a reduction of approximately 300 positions. Some of these reductions have already been realized through existing vacancies and our workforce initiatives to mitigate the number of permanent layoffs. Council and administration worked hard to find solutions to minimize the workforce impact, but unfortunately, there will be a loss of staff positions. With the budget now concluded, administration will work through the next steps related to these workforce reductions, and we plan to have this completed in early 2021. Before I move on, I want to emphasize that the work of every City of Edmonton employee is important and adds significant value to Edmontonians. Any reductions, whether they are staffing or service reductions, will be a loss to someone in our community. This was hard work. Council made these decisions with the understanding that we are operating in a challenging economic climate, and we must respond with bold solutions to ensure that we can move forward with focus. Shifting gears, a number of facilities were recommended for closure, but based on council discussion and debate, those facilities were moved back into the budget while still maintaining a 0% tax increase. We will consider the timing for reopening these facilities as we continue to address the health measures and impacts from the pandemic. Recognizing the ongoing impact to those that keep our city running and depend on transit, Council voted to freeze cash fares for transit at $3.50 for an adult until May 1st of 2021. Council also responded to the community to keep the spay and neuter program in place, returned all planned service hours for Edmonton's transit bus network redesign, and continued the neighborhood Green Shack programming and extended turf maintenance service season. Into 2021, you will see other strategies coming forward to advance the strategic vision, such as the Economic Development Action Plan, Housing Strategy, Community Safety and Wellness Strategy, and critical work on the climate file. This will be supported by the 2021 implementation of some major initiatives that have been in the planning phases over the past number of years. I already mentioned the bus network redesign, the citywide waste cart rollout, and the continued investment and development of LRT as the backbone of our future mass transit system as identified in the city plan. There is no doubt there is likely to be further financial challenges. And as a city, we will need to ensure the service we deliver are safe, affordable, and aligned with the strategic vision of Connect Edmonton and the recently approved city plan. We will continue to respond to the emerging challenges. We will be agile as an organization while still committed to building the city Edmontonians have told us they want for the future. With that, happy to take any questions.
Thank you. We'll open it up for questions now. What we'll do is go to each one of you on the line for questions, for one question and a follow-up. Then at the end, we'll open it up for any last questions. So first, we'll go to Dustin Cook with Post Media, please. Dustin?
Thank you very much. I think both of my questions are for the mayor. Mr. Mayor, I'm wondering if you can give us a little bit of a brief tax lesson here, I guess. While council has set the increase to 0%, that doesn't necessarily mean that residents won't see a different number next spring when they get their bills. Can you take us through why that is, and then how the education property tax from the province could impact this as well?
Sure. Well, this is my 14th attempt at assessment and taxation for dummies, not for everybody. And the way it works is there are a number of variables that establish a given property owner's bill. The first and largest is what council asks everybody to pay. That's the taxation level that is shared across all of the different properties. Where assessment kicks in is how the share for each individual property owner is determined. So if all the properties stay the same, and in this year this will actually be the chance for people to really see how this plays out, because everybody's request to contribute should be the same. But if somebody's taxes go up nonetheless, or their bill goes up, it's because the assessed value of their property has risen by more than the average. Likewise, if someone's taxes go down, even though overall we're asking everybody to put in the same amount, it's because the value of their property fell relative to the average change of other properties. So that is how assessment determines everybody's relative share. And there's always a bit of movement in that from one year to the next. People receive their assessment notices in January and will have an opportunity, if they think that the assessed change in value of their property is wrong, to appeal that prior to receiving their ultimate tax bill later in the spring. The third variable that you mentioned, and I'm glad you did, is what the province of Alberta does with the education property tax requisition. That is entirely out of the control of municipal government. So depending on what the province sets as a bill, if they ask for the same across all households and businesses as they asked for last year, then the changes would be minor. If they increase it in any way, obviously that will flow through to taxpayers, but we don't actually know that until the province reveals that as part of the budget, which is one of the reasons why we don't finalize setting the mill rate for all of the tax notices that get set out and send those tax notices out until later in the spring. It's actually, we could do it today actually if it wasn't waiting for the provincial government's property tax requisition. So we wait with bated breath to see what signal the provincial government will send with its establishment of the education property tax requisition, which is maybe a third, a quarter to a third of what the average residential property's tax share would be, and maybe a fifth of what the average business tax would be, give or take. We can get you follow-up numbers on that. So it's not the largest variable, but it is a variable outside of our control.
Dustin, did that answer your question on taxes? Would you like a clarification or a follow-up?
I do have a quick follow-up. That was very helpful. Thank you, Mr. Mayor. On that, is, this spring, there was still quite the discussion about the tax rate, and it actually was decreased. Do you think that this is something that could come up again in the spring, be it with impact of the provincial budget or COVID, that this conversation still continues next spring before it's actually definitively a 0% tax increase?
Well, we'll know a lot more by the spring supplemental budget adjustment, which informs the ultimate setting of the mill rates and issue of the tax notice. We'll know a lot more then, but even today we know a lot more than we did when we made those spring adjustments last year about the impact of COVID. And we forecast that as best as we can. In spite of potential good news about vaccines, we know the next several months are going to be very challenging for transit. Our rec centers are closed again as of midnight Saturday, and so we, as of now, midnight tonight actually, sorry. So obviously we're going to be bleeding again in both of those service areas. We've planned a certain amount for that. The big variable will be the provincial and federal operating support to all municipalities technically runs out March 31st. So I'm hopeful that we'll have a clear sense of what operating support, at least for public transit, will look like from provincial and federal governments by the end of March, so that we can all true up our budgets, hopefully with a little more operating support for the challenges of shutdown and the impact that has. Like, we're going to keep running transit, obviously, to get people to work, but with so many folks at home and locked down, obviously revenue is going to plummet again for the first part of next year, and it will take some time to recover, potentially a few years to recover, just like the convention center business we forecast will take a couple of years to recover. So really understanding what the next bit of federal aid will look like would be the biggest variable going into the spring budget adjustments, but I cannot imagine a scenario where there will be anything other than or above a 0%, essentially the property tax freeze. I don't think that's at risk between now and then, but at the rate the last few years have gone, who knows what 2021 will bring, but I think we're in a relatively resilient position. And the other, though I guess the other big variable, the province has sent signals that there will be, as part of this fiscal reckoning that we're told is coming, impacts to municipal grants for infrastructure. We've seen some erosion in support for police last year. And so depending on what else happens in the provincial budget, there could be some additional challenges for us to absorb by the spring. I hope not, because I would hope that we have very clearly done our part up to this point. But we'll see what happens with the spring federal and provincial budgets. Yeah, I'll leave it there.
Thank you. We'll go next to Vinesh Pratap with Global, please. Vinesh?
Yes, this one's for the mayor as well. Mayor, I know in years past you've talked about, robbing Peter to pay Paul, and you alluded to some of that in your initial comments here. But, is there any worry that, future councils will have to pick up the slack for the 0%, or are you confident that, a right balance has been found here?
Well, thanks for the question, Vinesh. And there are two ways to get to zero. One way is to cut your ongoing expenditures against your ongoing property tax revenue, which is what we've done, which is a sustainable cut. And the other way is to paper it over using one-time money for 1 year, which still leaves you spending the same amount of money. And we did see a proposal to that effect, which council roundly rejected. And other municipalities have done this quite a bit, where they continue spending without any particular restraint, but cover it over using reserves or other one-time sources of funds, which just moves the tax increase out until it's called the bow wave effect. Those all catch up with you. Often in an election year, or this is done, and then in the year after it catches up with you. This council has been extraordinarily courageous and consistent in not doing any of that kind of fiscal short-termism to get to zero. And I'm proud of this council for that, and I think our fiscal credentials as a group speak for themselves in that regard. And so there aren't hangover effects waiting for the next council, other really than a decision about what to do with the community investment grants going forward, but that program needs to be redesigned anyway, and was going to be lost if we didn't use some of the one-time policing dollars to cover it for this year. And those dollars were freed up precisely to invest in community. So I think there'll ultimately be $11 million ongoing for community capacity building programs by 2022. Investment grants could be part of that, but I think we want a really strategic look about how to build community capacity to support crime prevention, community empowerment, fight systemic racism, all of those themes that we heard about previously. So that's the one place where the next council will have some decisions to make about community investment grants, but there's actually ultimately by 2022 $11 million available for them to make strategic investment in community.
Vinesh, would you like a follow-up?
Yes, in a completely different topic. I apologize for kind of segueing to this. Just a bit COVID related. Mayor, we've heard from some taxi operators that they're picking up people who are going for COVID testing, and they're concerned that they might be exposed, and so they're wondering if anything can be done through the Vehicle for Hire Commission to maybe have designated vehicles related to this, or more specialized protection. Has that ever been brought up in conversation, or could be looked at for consideration?
There are, the city had guidelines in place in the spring. Those were superseded ultimately by provincial guidelines for all vehicle for hire. Your suggestion's an interesting one, and I think merits follow-up, but to my knowledge, that particular request certainly hasn't come before council, so I'd have to take that back to our vehicle for hire folks to think about, and they, through Adam's nodding, and we'll take that back and see what we can get for you on that, Vinesh.
All right, thank you. Next we'll go to Emily Mertz, also with Global. Emily?
Thanks. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, wonderfully. Go ahead, please.
Okay, so I was just listening to the council meeting, Mayor, and you said that there were several criminal incidents as a result of enforcement of public health orders that the police were dealing with. Could you just expand on that? I missed the number, and you kind of mentioned it as you were talking about the $5 million less that police will have.
Yeah, I was just referring to media reports quoting the chief of police suggesting that they would really prefer not to be in a position of having to intervene in the case of violations of the mask bylaw, but there have regrettably been a number of incidents where folks have been quite belligerent. Alcohol has been involved, mental health has been a factor in some cases, but ultimately where folks have flouted the rules and been very difficult about it, police have had to be involved, and just quoted in the story, there were 39 incidents. So I haven't had the chance to speak to the chief about this myself. I was just reading about this morning, but it's just an example of the pressure that all public services are under, particularly frontline public safety services, during a time of really high anxiety, really high fear, and so it's just an example of what public servants are dealing with on the front lines, and that's not getting easier right now in the midst of COVID, and so that was the context in which I was mentioning it as well. That demand for our public services is not going down, but in fact going up, and that's a particularly egregious example that I wish wasn't happening. But also, people are in rough shape out there, and they're acting out, and that's my point. Is just that's creating more demand for policing, in particular, in this case, regrettably.
Emily, would you like a follow-up on that?
No, I'm fine, thank you.
Thanks so much. Next, we'll head to Jeremy Thompson with CTV, please. Jeremy?
Yes, hello. I'm not sure, Mayor, if this question is for you or for Adam. Just wondering, sort of going off of what Vinesh was asking about the impact for future councils of this decision. What is the current tax increase set at for 2022 at the moment, and is there going to be any effort to, I guess, sort of early days talking about that, but just any comments you can make about the knock-on effects for next year?
No, that's fair. Well, because, as I mentioned earlier, the savings that we've harvested here are a lot of ongoing savings. There are some one-time savings related to COVID, but there are a lot of sustainable and ongoing savings here that will help future year budgets as well. And in the 2022 numbers, which were also adjusted today, that's down to 1.6. Which really is sort of inflation coverage in that year. And so the next council after the election will have an opportunity to look at that and make further adjustments to it based on the circumstances of the time, and that's a long way from now, but that's the value of long-range budgeting, is that you can't get away with kicking things out to future years because you have to look out 4 years at a time. And so we've set up the next council, I think, for reasonable success with a very modest, essentially inflationary increase, which I think is, people should not come to expect zero to be the norm, because that actually would erode over time the city's position just against inflation and growth. And so 1.6 is essentially a sort of an inflationary coverage equivalent for 2022 at this point. Again, that'll be the next council to refine in whichever direction they choose.
Jeremy, would you like a follow-up to that?
Please. So, Mayor, you mentioned this as well in your opening statements here, that council was able to find the money for a lot of the sort of the big items that were of public concern for potential cuts, the rec centers, the neuter spay program, the community grant stuff. So I'm just wondering, with that stuff sort of covered off, what do you think will be sort of the most noticeable impact for the average Edmontonian moving forward from this budget?
I think the most noticeable impact for the average Edmontonian will be that their tax bill, barring assessment shifting that we talked about earlier, won't change from this year to next. I think in terms of frontline services, the firefighters will still come, the police will still come if you need them. The grass will still get cut, though we were going to start cutting it a little bit later in the season, so there's some minor changes there, but nothing like what we saw last year. Just a lot of nips and tucks and optimizations, most of which the public likely won't see. But in the case of overall, they'll notice the property tax bill being even. In the case of the things that we were able to refund, certainly in certain neighborhoods, people will appreciate, once COVID allows, certain facilities surviving for another year here, recognizing, as we've all seen, that they do need replacement strategies or revitalization strategies, as the case may be. So folks will appreciate that, but really council put in essentially less than maybe 0.1% of the overall budget back in terms of programs that we wanted to keep alive and bus service hours that we wanted to keep, pools that we wanted to keep open. And we were able to find offsets for that in a few other reallocations and in some of the efficiencies that the library management and board offered up voluntarily in the spirit of the constraint that we're all facing. So very, very minor nips and tucks on our part. In terms of overall, not just in this budget with $54 million in dozens of different reduction strategies, but over several years, we have substantially improved the operating efficiency of this organization through the program and service review, through the 2% initiative before that, and we've taken, I don't have the exact number, I have to go back and look it up, but it's certainly tens of millions of dollars, over $100 million cumulatively out of the budget without compromising service levels for the most part. I would suggest that we're getting at the limits of what you can do there without fundamentally affecting service levels. If a future council were to have an appetite for further cuts, you'd really start having to cut frontline services, which we've already started to nip away at here a little bit. And I would hope, as an Edmontonian returning to private life, private taxpayer status, that the city doesn't go in that direction of deep austerity and service level cuts going forward. We're really at the limits of what we could do in terms of efficiencies and continuous improvement for the organization. Though continuous improvement will always be a goal, there's always opportunities to improve.
Thank you. Natasha Reeb, CBC. Natasha?
Thanks. I don't know this.
Oh, Natasha, you're breaking up a little bit. You try it again?
Competitive about what Jeremy just asked, but I was thinking what. Oh, I'm not on there, am I?
No, you're good. Go ahead, Natasha. We can hear you now.
Okay,
Please,
thanks.
Go ahead.
Okay, many people who aren't in the nitty gritty of all of this process, again, would probably be wondering, why this next year of all years, we're going to get a 0% after 2 decades. And so, if you could just give us a very broad snapshot to explain to people quite simply, you mentioned nips and tucks, but broadly, how did we get here this time?
Well, over the last 20 years, we went from a period of austerity with a council that was cutting taxes, thinking that would lead to economic growth, and it didn't. But later, and in fact, the consequence of that was that one of the things council did was lay off the people who patched the cracks in the pavement. And 10 years later, when the roads started falling apart, people saw the consequences of those short-sighted decisions from a decade before. And then at that same period of time, what we had was the fastest growth the city's ever experienced, massive inflation and cost pressure because of what was happening in Alberta on the industrial side of construction. And so we had huge inflation pressures, huge growth pressures, and a bunch of the aging infrastructure was falling apart for neglect. And in that perfect storm, councils of the day, which I was a part of, undertook significant tax increases for things like the neighborhood renewal dedicated tax levy, which are now in place and allow us to catch up on all of that infrastructure and look after it properly going forward so that we don't fall into the same kind of neglectful infrastructure deficit that was the consequence of those 0% tax increases a generation ago. The circumstances here are very different. This is a certainly once in a generation economic crisis. I think on a one-time basis, given what everyone is facing out there, and given that there are many businesses and many households with the highest unemployment rate in the country, and with businesses that are struggling, asking them to pay more for essentially the same services from one year to the next would be challenging. And so we've worked hard to cover the inflation impacts and other impacts, which you can do once, but to expect that several years of zeros are practical going forward without affecting frontline services would just be unrealistic. So this was a very, very special circumstance, and council's been very, very careful not to enter into some of the kind of cutting and short-termism that ended up costing this city so much more to rectify in the years following those zeros from the do-nothing 90s.
Would you like a follow-up?
Okay, thank you. I know you've explained that before. I guess I was just thinking about the past few years, but that's fine. And I think my next question is for Adam.
It's all in the broader context.
I know, thank you.
Well, I will say, I appreciate if the context of your question is in the last few years. You'll see in some of the material that administration presented in the last several fiscal updates, as well as in response to the city auditor's evaluation of the city's fiscal position, that we really have worked to level off spending, level off growth in employees in the organization. Some of those metrics like full-time equivalent staff per capita have been flattened out. And so it's not just this year, it's not sort of a one-time restraint. Really, given the economic circumstances our city and province have found themselves in over the last several years, council has worked hard to level out a number of those indicators reflecting the fiscal circumstances we're in, while not compromising investment in the future of our city, and particularly rapid transit infrastructure that is absolutely elemental to laying the building blocks for that denser, more cost-effective and efficient, lower carbon city that we're trying to build in the city plan.
Natasha?
Elaborate.
Thanks. Yeah, I wouldn't mind asking Adam something. Thank you.
Yeah, go ahead, please.
Hi, Adam. And, I just want to get a bit of context into the transit component. Because that projected, 2.7, which is now, I guess, $2.5 million estimated revenues, was based on pre-COVID ridership levels. So, and again, I know you won't be in this position come next or in January, but what is the idea of how the city is going to reevaluate that come the spring, with ridership levels probably not expected to be even half of what, that estimate was based on?
Thanks, Natasha. So we do evaluations on the performance of our transit system, and our folks do an assessment of optimistic, pessimistic, realistic, and we just based on the conditions that we're experiencing, we try to find where in that we would peg our ridership. Certainly, the mayor alluded to this, the latest restrictions, and kudos to council for the commitment to continue to providing the service, even though the ridership is going to be significantly impacted with these restrictions. And like everybody, our hope is that we start to see the numbers flattening in terms of cases and transmission, and then the slow rebuild of the ridership. So certainly challenging over the next month to try and define exactly what we anticipate that ridership adjustment being, and equally difficult in the new year. But our folks monitor that on a regular basis, and then using their modeling provide their best estimate on a optimistic, pessimistic, and realistic scenario. And from there, we identify and recommend to council what adjustments should be made. And in this case, I think we're in a position where, and one of the councillors alluded to this, we had a business plan for transit, and we feel we need to advance that business plan for transit, especially when you're considering the bus network redesign that's going to be implemented in 2021.
Thank you.
I have one more quick one, if that's okay.
Yeah, go ahead, Natasha.
Did we, the full-time positions that were kind of incorporated into the budget that would either be vacant or, workplace efficiencies, it noted 338 positions, and today I think the mayor spoke of 300 positions. Could you give us kind of like the final estimate of how many people will actually be laid off?
So it's a bit of a moving target. We're still rationalizing that, but what started out at 347 positions being recommended to be eliminated in the organization, and the composition of that would have been vacancies, positions through attrition or permanent layoffs, which is tough, reduced to 313 at this point in time. And again, it's pretty dynamic on the basis of rationalizing the amendments that were approved and making sure that we've got the numbers right. The proportion of that, 313, proportionally, around 63% are through vacancy management or attrition. And unfortunately, the other percentage, 63-37, is through permanent layoffs.
Okay, thank you, everybody. Let's just go to any final questions or clarifications that anybody has. Are there anybody looking for anything more there? All right, not hearing any. Thank you very much, and thanks for everybody being here. Thanks.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.